when we talk about annual evaluations, or we talk about 6-month evaluations, depending on what jurisdiction and what agency you're with, when people are starting to talk about police reform, defunding the police, you know, I understand that you have a background in internal affairs. When you have a police officer or somebody that's beneath you that you're supervising that has, you know, a certain number of incident reports, my question for you is first, what number does that number have to be before a review is done in internal affairs? And is it just something that's routine, or does it only happen when there's an actual incident that takes place?
So like with us, just to give you a for instance, we would look at the close proximity. Say if an individual got a complaint, one in a 3-month period, if he has 2 use of force or 1 complaint, we'll pull him in and talk to him. If in that 3-month period, if he has 3 or 4, you know, complaints, you know, we'll pull him in and talk to him. But as a shift supervisor, Josh, you know, it's your job to pay attention to your officers and pay attention to, you know, the individuals that are working under their attitude. You could tell when somebody changes. You could tell when somebody has personal issues going on, and your role is to pull them in, you know, at that time and just kind of talk to them, you know, before they get to that point. Or even if you see something out of character. You know, my father told me that there's only 2 ways you get to know somebody. You know, you either live with them or you work with them. And because those 2 ways are around them pretty much every day. And, you know, you could take a look at the people in your profession and the people that you work around, Josh. You know, you could tell when they come in and there's something is not right with them. And, you know, it's when those signs are signs that supervisors, you know, ignore. And a lot of supervisors nowadays, you know, aren't taking the time to, you know, teach their officers how to deal with stress, how to deal with aggression. And they think, getting back to what the doctor says, hey, well, we're just going to shove it along because, you know, we're friends and they'll be all right.
Yeah. So
what I hear you, I'm sorry, what I hear from you, Kyle, and I'm encouraged. I mean, I'm really encouraged by hearing you speak, because I hear from you values to me that are important in your position, which is integrity, honor, truth, honesty, and challenging people. And I think like it's hard to do that in a management position, but these are to me the characteristics I think about in officers that we want to engender and embody and even parent, because you talked about your dad and you talked about the values that your father and family instilled in you. And that's, again, so important, especially when we get into the issues brought up long in our discussion of what drives somebody to go into law enforcement. Is it that they want power over people? Is it that they want power with people? Is it they have issues of injustice they've carried with them that they want to play the judge, jury, and executioner? Or is it that they want to foster, I said, a community to bring people along? And this is, again, these are things that when I hear law enforcement officers and people in positions of management like you, I just want to compliment you and tell you I think it's great discussion that you brought up.
Well, thanks, Doc. And all those reasons why you say people get into law enforcement, it's just for all those reasons. They get into it for their own personal reason. And I can only share with you the reason why I got into law enforcement. And the reason why I got into law enforcement, I grew up, I was an at-risk youth, got in trouble all the time. You know, I dropped out of high school and, you know, I pretty much ran amok. I had a daughter at 16 years old. I mean, you couldn't really tell me anything. I was the youngest one of my mother's 7 kids. And I almost lost my brother out there to street violence. He was shot and almost died. And, you know, that changed my life. I went back to school immediately. I got my high school diploma. I was the only one of my mother's kids, you know, to drop out, but the first one to give her a 4-year degree. But it's that tragedy that turned me, you know, to law enforcement. It was certain things that I wanted to get out there. I wanted to, one, I wanted to save and spend time with at-risk youth and save our youth. 2, I wanted to become that officer that protected the community from rogue police officers. because I was mistreated as a youth growing up, and I can understand some of that mistreatment. But even in law enforcement, you know, I was stopped, and I was even mistreated at my own house by the police when I was a police officer in Gwinnett County, which led me to file a complaint on an officer, which was pretty much sustained. I think, Josh, to touch on a question when they talked about the saying of driving while black. When my wife had her baby, you know, we had our baby. I said to my wife, I said, man, I'm ready to have another one. She said, that's because you didn't carry this one. Labor pains are real. She's saying to me that I wouldn't understand it because I didn't have to carry that baby. You know, when they talk about driving and being fearful, you know, for African Americans, Josh, that is real. I could tell you as a father, I'm scared. You know, when my 20-year-old daughter is pulled over by the police, I've been scared when my 31-year-old daughter called me and she was pulled over by the police in Stone Mountain, and you know, I get down there and the cop has her pulled over behind a building in Stone Mountain, which he had no business having her pulled over. But he was later arrested and convicted for pulling over and, you know, doing things to women that was inappropriate in DeKalb County. You know, so it's a whole lot, the history that African Americans have suffered at the hands of law enforcement, you know, brings on that fear on why, you know, African Americans feel fearful when they're pulled over by the police, or they have encounters with law enforcement, because you don't know which way it's going to go, and you could be as polite to them as you know, as you possibly can, but it's going to boil down, Josh, to that individual. And you know, like they said on the panel before, it's a lot of bad seeds. It's a lot of bad seeds, and those bad seeds mess it up pretty much for the majority of law enforcement. The first and foremost purpose of law enforcement is not to fight crime. It's for preservation of life and property. The crime part comes along with the preservation of life and property. So it was interesting listening to this panel before I was able to start speaking. So if I touch on several different topics, it's because you hit a lot of good questions. You hit the nail right on the head with things that, you know, I wanted to speak about.
Can I ask a question, Deion Washington? Had you ever heard that term before? Because I'd never heard that term before Kyle said that. Preservation of life, that's the role of law enforcement. Had you ever heard that?
Sir. Yeah.
You heard that? Cause listen, I've been doing this work for 25 years. That's just not a term I heard. And when people went like from the military straight into law enforcement, I was like, listen, I was infantry and then I was artillery. And of course, let me just tell you, that term did not come up in basic training in Fort Benning, and that term, preservation of life, did not come up at Fort Sill. The goal was to separate limbs from bodies. The goal was preservation of life. So when he said that, he said it, and he was the second person in a week to say it. I had never heard that term from law enforcement before.
Yeah. That's primarily a law enforcement term that police recruits here in the academy. In an ideal situation, police always want to try and preserve life, protect life, and make sure that each encounter they engage with results into everybody going home if it's possible.
Yeah. You understand that I'm typically awake when I'm in court, and I'm typically engaged. So when 25 years go by and I don't hear this term, and I hear it twice in like 5 days, it sort of sticks with me. Preservation of life. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, but it goes too well with the training, Lawrence. You know, even though the police officers are taught to double tap and shoot center mass, then everybody know the outcome of that is deadly. But you know what they're trained to. The training thought and the verbiage is to stop the stop the threat. And one of the things that you're taught is after you do shoot an individual, you know, you have to render aid to them.
And that's the part, Dr. Fisher. That's the part for me. Listen, you shoot at me, I double tap you, and then as soon as you down, I switch into this other mode of running over to you helping. I'm sort of going to get a drink from the shooting. And that's the interesting conversation with me and Kyle. That's when I really realized I shouldn't be law enforcement. Shoot twice and then immediately run over to render aid. That was bipolar to me.
Sounds like you have some issues with grudges. We'll talk in my office later, all right? No, but that's the thing is that an officer to me has to be able to shift their role like that and being able to train people to be able to adapt. It's adaptation, especially in that role, because you have to be able to determine how quickly is there a threat? How quickly has it been kind of calmed down? Who now is a threat? And that's where when you look at domestic violence issues, who's a bigger risk to get harmed in domestic violence when an officer responds is an officer from the female, right?
Yeah.
Now they're going to move to protect their spouse who they were just having this huge conflict with. So that's where, again, that ability to adapt, to read, to understand psychologically, to then be in a place of understanding. My job is I always feel like I have to understand where my person's coming from first, not me. And that to me is also a really key part of, of law enforcement too, because I think it's easy to become numb. It's easy to become, when I talk about power, I talk about two models of power. Hierarchical model of power, which is like a big circle to little circle. And then I talk about equity models of power, where we all have the potential for the same amount of power, so same size circles. Our culture is based in this hierarchical model of power. And it's based in the idea of having power over people. Or in that, it's based in often the idea of playing the victim. So there are roles that are played in that culture: victim, persecutor, rescuer, and then in that, the instigator. So I say we live in a victim culture because so many, you look at your job as an attorney is because you're the rescuer trying to rescue the victims, right? The police officer.
Or as I see it, I'm there trying to fight with the prosecutor.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So you're there to rescue them.
Yes.
And they're playing the victim. And then the officers, their job is to play rescuer, but then they become the persecutor. So we have to look at how these roles shift, because even in the victim, you can either learn to play the learned helplessness role, meaning you take the abuse and that's what you expect and you don't come out of the cage no matter what. And or you become the justified persecutor, meaning I'm a victim first and I justify my persecution of you because you tried to victimize me, okay? In this role, like I said, I've written books on this stuff too, so I'm trying to kind of get it to the point because I think it's really important in this discussion to understand that one of the biggest things I think a lot of officers are trying to understand is I came in this role to help people. As we've talked about, there are the bad cops who come in it to exploit, and they want to have power over, and they're waging out their own vendettas or psychological issues through their job. But so many people came in this idea to want to help, to be the rescuer, and it didn't work out. The problem is that it's the people in the victim role who are the most powerful. If I'm the victim, I choose who my persecutor is. I choose who my rescuer is. And that's where I explain the idea of the domestic violence police call is at first, the persecutor is the spouse who's abusing the victim. Then the officer becomes the persecutor because now that rescuer is potentially going to go to jail because they abuse that. So you can see how quickly these roles play and why it is so complex from a power perspective. And if we had more clear understandings and we talked more and had more of these forums to, like I said, I've loved Kyle's discussion and Dion and everybody who's in these roles of really sharing, this is what I've been through, this is what it's like. And we had people in communities engaged in understanding rather than judgment. we would have a different culture in society. And that is about equity. That's about finding balance and mutual understanding rather than judgment and blame.
Let me just tell you this, Doctor, so that you're clear. I asked at least 20 law enforcement to come on the panel. And just the time that we're in, the cancel culture, everybody's nervous about saying the wrong thing or saying the right thing at the wrong time. So the dialogue has sort of been squashed.
It takes courage.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah, it's squashed. So I think the officers that came today.
Doctor, I agree with you 100%. Police, we don't generally do a good job of doing things like this. Unfortunately, the vast majority of time when people see law enforcement, something bad just happened. It's a person's worst day. They're emotional, and that emotional range runs the full gambit. And the time to foster communication is in an environment like this, where everything is okay. Nobody's mad. Everybody's happy. Everybody's wearing their best clothing. You can sip on your coffee or tea, and you can just sit down and have a conversation. I can explain to you my perspective. I can hear yours, and we can just exchange information back and forth. That's extremely critical that we get out into these communities, the communities that are labeled good, bad, and no named. And we make those citizen contacts with the leaders within these communities, from the clergy members to the leaders in every facet.
Well, and I think one of the issues run into is I also talk about dichotomies and the ways we look at power. And that dichotomy means the state of cutting things into two. So the 4 dichotomies I talk about are good and bad, right and wrong, strong and weak, and win and lose. The ultimate dichotomy is win and lose. Now, how you get there is different depending on the person. Part of what I've seen shift in our culture in the last 4 years is more strong and weak being the way to win, because and here's why we fight wars. We fight wars to look strongest. And if we're strongest and we win the war, we define the good and the right of the culture. Okay. So even when I've been on CNN, I've talked about the 2008 elections, 2012, 2016 elections, and I always talk about those facets of the idea of battle and war, because it's a winner take all idea. There's no middle ground, and that's what's happening right now. Is everybody? It's either the police's fault or it's the victim's fault. It's the Antifa's fault. It's the right's fault. We're not looking at understanding all the pieces from an equity standpoint that go to feed the problem, and that's what I see as part of the justice issue. Is either you're guilty or innocent, and it's all or nothing, and that's a hard pill to swallow. If you know from the law enforcement standpoint, your person that you have formed this case against is guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt, but they either work the system, or if you're on the victim's or the accused standpoint and you absolutely know you didn't do it, but you got somebody out to make sure they're right because they have their check lot, their belt that they're checking off their number of successful trials on. And that's again where we have to, I think, look at reform, not just about punishment, but about rehabilitation.
Yep.
I think
I wrote a note, Josh. I wrote a note here because it was sort of interesting. Dr. Fisher was coming at it from I guess, a holistic criminal. My world is very limited. Deion Washington, homicide, rape, armed robbery. That's right or wrong. That's not the drug cases. That's not the rehab cases. That's not the send you to counseling. That's not the shoplifting. Our world is just somebody's dead or severely injured, and the punishments, the mandatory minimum punishment is life for 25 years. That's the world we live in. So it was nice that even as you were talking earlier, it's like, oh, that's right. That's right. Shoplifting is also a crime, because that's just not a whole lot of what Deion Washington did. Deion Washington didn't go to the Walmart and put handcuffs on somebody for stealing a blouse. When he was there, somebody was dead. So our world is sort of limited to right or wrong because of the gravity of the offense. That's what I would call it. The gravity of the offense makes it more dichotomous. There's less room for gray because somebody's dead and somebody's got to be held responsible. Does that make sense?
I don't disagree with it at all. I totally agree. And so there's a yes, there is a guilt or innocence and not a but. Because again, we have these situations where our prisons are overcrowded. We have situations where they are sitting in there and they're stewing in their anger, rage, or hatred or vengeance, or they're just not learning. And what are we doing to help understand that there are still mitigating circumstances that don't negate their action? Because I always say there are explanations for behavior, not excuses. I say that with the people I work with all the time. And we have to have the understanding so that we can make sure not only are they out of society where they can't do harm, but they're also in a place where they can potentially work on the issues or get the support system. And we just don't throw those people away because of what they've done. And I think that's where we need to look at our system. And even like I said, I think that's how law enforcement sometimes feels. They made a mistake because something happened. They had an offense happen. There were mitigating circumstances, and they're out of there. And then they're alienated. They're alone. They're abandoned. And it's not about, like I said, excusing it. It's about understanding the whole picture.